Welcome to the Syndicate from the Business of Hockey and the Goal with your hosts Richard York and Les Kowalski. Sit down, have a cigar and scotch, listen to some good music, and we'll talk hockey and business. Let's start this episode. We want to provide a little bit of insight to what the Syndicate is.
Well, with the other series, we talked about the management of hockey operations. In the Syndicate, we want to talk about the ownership of hockey and how it relates to businesses all around the world. Because all hockey is one giant business. And it's not even the biggest one in the sports world. You know, hockey's on a smaller tier compared to baseball or football, even soccer in Europe. We want to talk about hockey. It's what we can relate to and talk about. And it'll be great. We're going to compare transactions that have been happened in business ownership of hockey, and we're going to compare it to everyday life.
We're also going to get into the actual business tactics that are actually being used within the organizations. Also, initiatives that these organizations are doing right now to be competitive amongst themselves. One of them is analytics. And I know that there's a lot of confusion on what that means. And so we're going to get into a lot more of that part and also some of the technologies and applications with that. So the whole intent of the Syndicate is to really focus within the organization itself, the different components of the organization, how to propel that organization forward and maintain its operations financial sustainability from the hockey perspective. So the topic for today, we are going to talk about Ken Holland.
Yes, and how he ended up being an Edmonton Oiler. First off, the two ownership groups that we are talking about here is the Detroit ownership group, which is the Ilitch family in Detroit. Michael Ilitch bought the Detroit Red Wings in 1982 for $8 million US. That is it. $8 million. 35 years ago. And the other ownership group we're talking about is Daryl Cates. And he's owned the team for 11 years. And some interesting facts on him is that he was born in Edmonton. And that's where he made his billions. He's worth $3.5 billion. And when he decided he wanted to purchase the Oilers, they were still in their old building called the Rexall Center. And his motive for buying the Edmonton Oilers franchise is that being a fan of the Edmonton area, he was an Oiler fan himself. And he felt that they needed an upgrade. The facility, the Rexall Center, which has since been improved to the Rogers Center. But the interesting note here I have is that Kate made 4 different offers to Oiler ownership to buy that team in 2008. 4 different times. He started at a $145 million, and his 4th offer came in at $200 million. And that is what he ended up buying the team for. They finally agreed that $200 million was an okay price. But the interesting note is that when he made his first offer, the ownership group told Cates, "It's not for sale, go away." And he did not. And the second offer came in. They said, "No, it's not for sale." Third offer, not for sale. 4th offer, well. So he eventually did it. But the note here is how hard he fought for it.
Yeah.
Right? Like he wanted it. And he got it. So I think the Edmonton Oilers are very fortunate to have an owner like Cates who fought hard to buy the team and to upgrade it into the new facility that it is in now.
Yeah.
So I think they're incredibly fortunate to have a passionate guy running the show there as the business owner. And now when we break it down to Ken Holland spent 36 years with the Detroit organization office. He started off as a scout and he worked his way up, and he spent the last 22 years as the general manager. He's got a handful of cups. He's got all kinds of president's trophies. He's got everything that you would want and need as a general manager of an organization. And he had incredible success there. And we're going to talk about how Edmonton Oilers were fortunate enough to to obtain this very valuable asset from a business point of view. So you had a very interesting theory about how this all transpired. So why don't you let us know how you think that a Detroit Red Wing for life man ended up getting promoted, and then less than 3 weeks after his promotion decided to take a demotion to come to Edmonton and be the general manager.
I think what's really important to understand is that when you're looking at these franchises, you have families who own these organizations. And the reason why the program is, or this series is called the Syndicate, is because in the investment banking community, when a company is going onto the stock exchange, there is a group of investment companies that come together to pool their resources in order to get that company over the fence and do something that they call an initial public offering. When the company becomes public, that means that all of the people that are the general public can own a piece of this organization. That grouping of investors in the pooling of money is called a syndicate. And so I thought it was very fitting for us to call this series the Syndicate, because you have a lot of different parts within the franchise itself that make up the franchise to make it whole. And you have different components that invest in it to bring it to win a cup, to make it to the playoffs. And so Kate's took it over. I'm not interested in getting into the political nature of the reasons of why it potentially worked or didn't work, but strictly from a management perspective and a systems perspective. But it became very evident when Holland was hired that Kate's had surgery and he had an amputation on his nose and he had a bacterial infection that was, he had a 50% chance of living. And so nobody really knew. I know it seemed to me that the Edmonton, the front office and the franchise for Edmonton, like it basically, the bike fell over. I don't know if you call it rudderless, but it was all over the map. And so nobody understood what the issue was. When you're doing any type of business, if you're an entrepreneur from a small business or a family business, or you have, they call it institutional business, which is $100, $200, $300 million in value, most owners are going to micromanage. They're going to want to be involved. They want to know what's happening in that organization. And, you know, there's articles that I've read where they talk about if you hire the right people, you just let them go free and they'll take you to the promised land. But if you look at an organization like Apple and you look at Steve Jobs, came up with the iPhone, but he was known for being one of the most intense micromanagers of his organization. You would tend to think that when you have an owner such as Kate's, who inherited the pharmacy business from his father and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar business, that he's not going to just not be involved.
Yeah.
And he's going to have some type of finger on the button to know what's going on.
Well, there's a lot of money at play, so that makes sense, right? That's a big business.
Exactly. You can have your deep pockets, but even those are finite. You know, it's like any resource. If you look at the last couple of years, it became very apparent that the organization was going down a path where there wasn't clarity and there wasn't any focus. Nobody knew what was going on until that press conference with Holland. You know, I made a statement that I believe what you're dealing with here is something much deeper than just having a GM come over. I've been of the belief previously, and I'm of the belief today, and I think I'm probably pretty close, but I get this vibe that Ken Holland is like he's on loan from the Ilitch family. And the reason I say that is the organization was in a complete shambles because the Ilitches have very tight organization, they look after their own.
Yeah.
I personally think that they were very concerned on the situation. There had to be a new structure and systems put into place because there was all these people that had come through previously and nobody could implement the proper systems. And this is what you're talking about, culture. There's been nothing in place. There's nothing. Edmonton hasn't had it. And so you've had all these different players coming through and people in the front office coming through, and there's no cohesiveness. And so my belief was Holland, even though he's making $5 million a year, he was asked more than likely by the Ilitch family what was happening with Kate's, and having things go so completely sideways that it would be affecting his family, portfolio, everything across the board. I think they looked at it and said, Ken, you need to go there and you need to snap this into place. And I believe that Ken is, when you're in business, I think one of the most important things is that there's two types of people. When you're an entrepreneur or you're an owner of a family business, you're going to have key people that are involved that are going to look after your personal work on your best interest, move the company forward and make sure things don't go sideways.
Yeah.
And I've always believed this, that there's two types of people. There's the one person who will see $200 million in a bank account. They won't know how to handle it. They'll take it as their own personal bank account. And then you have the other one that will be looking at it, protecting those funds on behalf of the family, whatever it is. And I think that's what Ken is. Ken is the loyalty. He's the protector. I think that the Ilitches asked Ken, go to Edmonton and snap this into place. Because I think they took pity on what was happening with Kate's. And they was taking pity for his health. Families that own these different franchises, there's a tightness there. It's one big family. They're not going to have someone fall because the people that are managing it don't know what they're doing. And so my belief is that you have Holland come in, you're seeing favors being brought in. There's the belief that Lucich's contract couldn't be broken, but it happened.
Yeah.
I think Holland called in some favors, right? I mean, from an optics standpoint, he had to. That was the albatross from the Oilers fan base, is that was the albatross that had to be moved. Holland has a lot of respect from me and from the fans and a very wide latitude. And person after person after person after person after person agree with that. So you're going to have some people that will go off onto a tangent and disagree with what he's doing and he needs to step up. But he has a lot of respect for what he's done and what he's accomplished. But I think there's a way more going behind the scenes than just you've got a GM here. I think this is a guy that's been brought in to let Kate's focus on his health and have somebody at the helm that's an adult.
No kidding. We talked on the Between the Hash Marks about Peter Chiarelli and the disaster that he was as general manager and president of hockey operations. So as you said, with Kate's going through his sickness and whatnot that we didn't know about at the time, Chiarelli had the keys to the castle, and Chiarelli made a disaster of it. But as you said, Ken Holland has a reputation, and he's done this for a very long time. It's probably just second nature to him, right? It's nothing out of the ordinary. And just to add to what you said there about Ken Holland, this is a quote direct from Daryl Cates when he did hire Ken Holland. They asked him what was the source of the phone call. What made him call up the Ilitch family and ask. And it says here, he knows how to build a culture of winning. And those were his words, right? So we keep talking about culture, and this came direct from the president. Sorry, not the president, the ownership. The owner of the Edmonton Oilers, knowing and fully understanding what kind of culture you need in a business and in a franchise to make it successful. And it starts from the top.
Correct.
Right? And it's amazing how the stability from the top, from ownership, right down, presidency, right, all the way down, affects the on-ice product. Now, we don't want to dwell too much into the on ice product, but I do have a question for you now that we've talked about the two sides involved here, that when they're on the ice, they're very much competitors. You know, the Detroit Red Wings and the Edmonton Oilers, they would steamroll the other team over if they could, right? Especially playoff time, right? They become fierce competitors. So how is that different from on ice up into ownership? Why isn't that same mentality carried up through the ranks?
Well, I think that a lot of the organizations that own franchises within the NHL, I mean, they're very professional. They look out for each other. They're not wanting to have a franchise implode on itself. I think it's one thing to be competitive in a healthy state and somebody sound mind, but when you're fighting something that is aggressive and you're in the hospital, everything in your life stops. Everything in the periphery stops. Whatever happens for you is by the goodness of people that are around you to have your life keep moving forward. And I think in Kate's situation, I think Kate's is exposed. And I still think he's exposed because there's a big mess that has to be cleaned up. And I think that the Ilitches knew, through relationships, they wanted to help Kate's out. Right? I think it's an act of kindness. I think regardless of what's on the ice, as fierce competitors, I think there's a level of professionalism and kindness that comes in those situations.
What you're kind of saying is that the NHL then is just one big business itself. Like when you actually break down into it, even those players that fight so hard and bang and fight and down on the ice there, you throw them into the Players Association during the CBA talks or anything like that. Suddenly they're best buddies. They're like,
that's right.
They're like soldiers in arms, right?
That's right.
And so what you're kind of telling me is that ownership is the same kind of way as that.
Saw a video. I can't remember who this was. There was one goalie that had gone up to another goalie, but one of the goalie's fathers had passed away. And the other guy from the other team skated all the way across the rink to have a talk with him. You're still going to have that competitiveness, but it's all very close-knit, right?
Well, it's still human beings.
Exactly, right.
And you got to treat each other with that respect. You're both there for them.
There's probably ownership groups in the NHL that don't take that type of perspective, but I think the Ilitches are old school. I think the Ilitches it's like old school business. I don't need a contract. I'll base it on a handshake. That's what I think. That's what I think they represent, and I think that's what Kate's represents.
Yeah,
is the old school business, not contracts and frivolous contract terms and all that.
Well, it does seem when you start dipping down into, well, it's because it's not nearly publicized either. But when you start dipping down into management and management decisions, you hear managers not liking other managers all the time. Even Kevin Lowe, when he was in charge of the Oilers here, I remember back in the day, and I was getting a little off topic, but he made an offer sheet to Dustin Penner from Anaheim.
Yeah,
Brian Burke was the general manager in Anaheim, and for a decade, those two wouldn't talk to each other anymore. Brian Burke was so upset that one of his players was signed to an offer sheet, just offended that even when he went to other teams, Kevin Lowe and Brian Burke would still not talk. So when you dip down from hockey operations down into, ownership hockey operations down into the management side, it seems to be like a whole different ball game, a whole different field.
I mean, you look at the tech sector, and you look at when Steve Jobs died. It was well documented that Bill Gates from Microsoft, Jobs from Apple, and Gates from Microsoft, they were fierce competitors from the beginning. But when Jobs was on his deathbed at home, he asked for Bill Gates to come, and he came, and they sat and they talked. So I think at the end of the day, there's a certain line when you're in that ownership role, you control the destiny and lives of so many people.
Yeah.
Right? Your whole perspective changes when you have, employees that work for you, right? You have their lives in your hands, literally.
Yeah.
Right? And so it becomes a different perspective and a different responsibility. And I think that one of the things that I always talk about with business is that there's no rules to business. It doesn't exist. Whatever flies. But I think if you look at the old school stuff where they would do things based on a handshake, that's what you're dealing with the Ilitches. And I think that they're doing it old school way based on a handshake. And I think they felt really bad and had great concern for Kate's and what was happening in the organization. And listen, everybody, in the media could see what was happening. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that the whole organization was rudderless. Yeah. And everything that they tried to do, they were spinning the wheels in every single direction. Nobody knew that Kate's wasn't around.
Yeah.
So somebody got the keys to the Ferrari, but didn't know how to drive around the racetrack.
Yeah.
Right? And so at the end of the day, Kate's is responsible for all the liabilities, for everything. When you look at these contracts that Shirelli's was doing, that's not Shirelli's money. To him, that was numbers. The guy was just throwing money around like it was going out of style. And I think that's a great fear, is that when you have someone working in representing you and has access to the bank account, you got to be on it, or you're going to become insolvent potentially, right?
Yeah. You'd have to be able to trust your management or your president of hockey operations to be doing their job. And obviously there was not a lot of trust there with Chiarelli based on the history of what he was doing in Edmonton. As you said, when you say rudderless, that's not because he came in and he was rudderless from the beginning. It's because he came in with the trust. Kate's hired him for a purpose, gave him those keys. He trusted him. And then he gave him I can't remember how many it was, like 5 years, 4 years. And Chiarelli, over that span, proved he was. And the business and the organization was going, nobody knew.
Well, and that was the whole problem. That was one of the biggest problems with Chiarelli as it was, is that it was bad enough that he didn't communicate in the media or in the public of what he was doing. But it became evident after he left, he didn't even communicate amongst anybody within the operations of the organization. Yeah. Nobody knew what he was doing, kept all his cards close to his chest.
Yeah.
You can't run an operation like that. And I don't know if he did that because it was out of fear. Sometimes take the perspective that if they're in a position, they don't want to share knowledge because then that increases their value. They can't be easily replaced. Yeah. But in reality, you have to look at the whole picture and the whole organization moving forward as one unit. If you're sitting in the back seat and everybody else is going in a different direction, like you have to be synced up.
Yeah.
And so from my perspective, I think what you're seeing right now, Ken has come in. I still believe he's on loan.
Yeah.
Because once this contract with Edmonton is up, he's going to go back to Detroit.
Well, in Detroit, they basically gave him a borderline retirement job. Him and, Steve Yzerman was groomed down in Tampa Bay as the general manager there.
Right.
And then when he was done there, it was no real secret that he wanted to come back to Detroit in some form or fashion. But with Ken Holland in that position already, there was only one of two ways Ken Holland could go. He could either be promoted up into hockey operations department and or he was going to get fired. And as we know with the Ilitch family, they're very loyal, and he's been part of that franchise for so long, right? You weren't just going to fire that guy. Not at all. They gave him a promotion into vice president of hockey operations, and he himself, Ken Holland himself, said that the contract that they gave him was very considerate. It was a very good contract. It was hard to not want it. And the transition between him and Yzerman went very well as well, because Ken Holland was part of the organization through Yzerman's entire career there. And they were friends. They were good friends. The transition went very smoothly. He had no reason to walk away.
Exactly.
He had a nice, cushy job. They gave him what he deserved. He was a loyal warrior for them for so long. And then just out of the blue, it was 18 days. 18 days after they hired Yzerman, he jumped ship.
Yeah.
And that may be not the right wording to use in that, because I guarantee you if you ask him about the the Ilitch family or the Detroit Red Wings organization, he would have nothing but good things to say, and he would not undermine them in any sort of way. So there has to be, like, he already signed that contract, right, to be the vice president of hockey operations for them, which means he needed permission to break contract. So it happened one way or the other. So there's definitely a lot of evidence to justify your theory, and I think it's a good one. But it goes to show that the ownership and the president of hockey operations department in each of these franchises run a lot differently than the management side. Like, it gets cutthroat when you get management and down to the ice. When you get up into the president of hockey operations and you get into ownership and stuff like that, it's a different ballgame. There's a different level of respect. You got the board of governors, right? They take votes. If somebody wants to buy a franchise, Kate's had to go through the approval process, right? Every other owner in the NHL had to give a yay or a nay to let him buy that team, right? And that's the same with any ownership. The topic material of the Syndicate episodes is going to be based on the hockey operations side of the franchise, because it is a lot different than the management side. And as you mentioned earlier in the episode, one of the tools given to management by hockey operations department is analytics. And analytics is something that's coming in more and more in this day and age. And it can mean so many things with analytics. Just a little taste of things is that when you look into the media and stuff like that, they like to use Corsair percentage, zone time percentage, shot suppression. Like, it's a lot of on ice analytics, and it helps gauge how well your team actually did outside of the score of the hockey game. In the end, it's the score of the hockey game that matters, but it gives you deeper insight into how player by player performed. And when you're dealing with hockey franchise, one of the most important things for any franchise to do is to draft and develop their own hockey players. And that is because they're brought up in their own system. Like, if we look at Detroit and Ken Holland, that whole team that Detroit drafted that's playing for their franchise now had very long talks with Ken Holland right from when they were 18 and drafted. These guys only know Ken Holland in Detroit, right? So he's a familiar face. He's that system, and he was that general manager that broke him into the league. And the analytics department sheds a very strong light on the whole drafting process, which we'll talk about more. Also, the analytics department changes the outlook on player development, drafting, how teams are playing. And if you're looking at the ownership side of things, analytics can be used on how their franchise is selling merchandise, how they're engaging with the fan base, and all kinds of other little things. Every little detail of that business is going to be scrutinized by an analytic department, because an analytic department is unbiased. It's numbers and data, right? That's what we talked about, is that analytics breaks everything down into a math equation. And it doesn't matter which franchise, it doesn't matter what fan base, doesn't matter location, whatever, right? Numbers are numbers. And I think analytics are incredibly important for the future of hockey and how it is slowly turning that way. From other sporting franchises like baseball, there's evidence there with Billy Beane and a gentleman named Theo Epstein. And these guys are analytic guys that broke into the league in baseball and made a huge impact. And potentially some of the viewership are probably wondering why Brendan Shanahan in Toronto hired a young general manager, a very young general manager. I think he's only mid-30s. You know, he's basically my age, and he's running a franchise. Why? And it's because he's an analytic guy. He comes from an analytic background, and Shanahan is trying to spearhead the new generation. Because the new generation in hockey is going to be very technically advanced. I think it is a fascinating topic that we are going to get into.
The technologies that are actually coming out now, being able to do the type of analytics, how you can actually do the analysis of that data and what you can actually get out of it. We talked about data as data. It's just how do you use that data in a strategic way, basically, right? So
yeah, how does it apply to whatever you're trying to apply it to? And it's different for every field of different. And when you're looking at the franchise, it is a tool given to management to use. And I think that's very interesting. And there's lots of management, old school management that we talked about that doesn't quite trust it or understand it quite yet. And there's a couple of franchises like the Toronto Maple Leafs that are trying to spearhead it, hoping to get a competitive edge. And that trickles from management down, though. So if you get back up into the hockey operations and the business ownership, it is a tool that they are all using, for their business. They had, this is a sophisticated business. It is a massive business. Like we talked about, it's the NHL is the business, right, of hockey. And they're all backing each other up. And they want to continue making money, right? Like all big businesses do. And I guarantee you that they got some stuff hidden in the closet there that we couldn't even imagine. That and we'll do our best. There's a few other leagues that are using fairly sophisticated tactics as well that we can probably pull comparisons off of. Mm-hmm. But I think it's going to be fascinating getting into this.
Well, and that's the thing is that with analytics, what's happening in general business, they call it digital transformation. It's the same thing. It's about how do you take data from whatever you have within the business and how are you able to actually analyze that data and then do something with it strategically. So it doesn't matter if you're applying it within a sport to get a competitive advantage as an organization, or you're a small business or entrepreneur and you need to know a certain amount of information as well to be able to make those strategic decisions. Analytics is coming in across the board. It doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter how tech savvy you are. It's coming in right across the board. It's very fascinating.
Well, that's why you have like these independent companies all over the place that offer this software to businesses. It's like third party. So if you're a business owner, you don't have to understand analytics because frankly, it's confusing. Right. It gets into some serious deep stuff. That's why they've had to invent AI technology, artificial intelligence technology to process this data because we can't.
That's right.
Not nearly at the pace it can though, right? So they have software, and these are independent companies that have this software basis that are offering this technology to companies,
that's right,
to businesses to process data that they already have. So it's not as business owners, big or small, that you need to know analytics.
Right.
You just need to know that it's just like in hockey, it is a tool out there available for you to use.
That's right. I hope you guys have enjoyed this first episode of the Syndicate. Do you have anything else to add before we sign off, Mr. York?
Well, I definitely feel that this Syndicate has a different edge on it. And as I told you earlier, I think it's a good series to have a cigar and a glass of scotch with. Right? So that's most of our fan base, I think, is going to be sitting there with that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that why this is important, I know that we're talking about the organization within hockey and how these tactics and analytics and these approaches are being used within franchises. But there's a lot of information and a lot of stuff that's happening that is being carried over out of the hockey world as well. The crossover is absolutely remarkable, what's happening in industry right now across the board. And so using this sort of as the stepping stool, moving into different things and talking about it. I mean, I'm really looking forward to it. I think this is going to be really unique. We'll be able to get into some really cool stuff.
Yeah, some of the other little Easter eggs I'd like to give the listeners is that we're not only going to talk about analytics. I think that's going to be a big part of what we want to talk about, but there's lots of ownership interests there that we can relate to. Like there was the John Tavares incident it's not an incident, but the situation in the New York Islanders, and that revolved right from ownership down, and the issues that happened there. And I think that'll be one of those fun topics. We're going to talk about Kyle Dubas from the Toronto Maple Leafs and the spearheading project that he's involved in, and the reasons behind his hiring, and definitely take a look at how he's doing from a business perspective.
I hope you guys have enjoyed this first episode of the Syndicate.
Get your scotch and cigars.
Talk to you soon, guys. Take care. Welcome to the Syndicate Lounge. Now, I hope you enjoyed this last episode of the Syndicate. One of the unique elements to this episode format is having us also promote independent musicians. So put your feet up and enjoy the next tune. The credit for this song can be found within the summary section at the bottom of this podcast episode. Enjoy. Thanks for listening to the Syndicate from the Business of Hockey and the Goal, produced by the Power Roadmap Podcast. Until next time.